Do not let the movies deceive you. Stepping onto a Wild West stagecoach was not a romantic adventure with ladies in flowing dresses, smiling under lace parasols. The horrifying truth is that stepping into that wooden carriage meant stepping directly into a dark dungeon. It was a one-way ticket into a living hell where your spine would be crushed and your organs torn apart with every violent jolt. The stench of disease and rotting decay would suffocate you inside a space no larger than a modern pickup truck. This is not a fairy tale. This is the brutal and bloody reality of the frontier. For a woman traveling alone in the lawless territory, the danger was not just the outlaws or the Comanche warriors waiting in the darkness. The most terrifying monsters were often sitting right next to her, breathing down her neck in the suffocating heat. Imagine being trapped in that rolling coffin for weeks on end. The capitalist companies running these lines cared nothing for human comfort or survival. They crammed up to 9 complete strangers into a tiny wooden box, forcing them to sit knee to knee for 24 hours a day. You could not stretch your legs. You could not escape the suffocating body odor, the smell of cheap whiskey, the thick clouds of black gunpowder residue, and the foul breath of desperate men. The air was thick and unbreathable. Every breath felt like inhaling the dust of corpses. And the psychological torture began the very second those swinging wooden doors slammed shut, locking you inside with potential murderers, bounty hunters, and outlaws. The frontier justice of the Wild West meant that if you vanished on the road, your bones would simply be devoured by the desert sands, and no one would ever come looking for you. For a woman, this isolation was a suffocating nightmare. The romanticized vision of the Wild West completely buries the absolute despair of these journeys. Every single jolt of the wooden wheels against the rocky terrain sent a shocking wave of pain straight into your bones. But the physical pain was only the beginning of the nightmare. If you were a woman, you quickly realized that you were trapped in a rolling cage with predators. The claustrophobia was overwhelming. The heat of the blazing sun turned the carriage into a literal oven, baking the passengers alive in their own sweat and filth. And when the sun went down, the freezing wind howled like the screaming of tortured souls, cutting through the thin leather flaps and chilling you to the bone. You had no protection. You had no voice. You were surrounded by men who had not seen civilization in months, men whose moral compasses had rotted away in the lawless frontier. The horrifying truth is that the stagecoach was a predator's paradise. As the carriage plunged into the darkness of the desolate trails, the fragile illusion of safety shattered completely. Every shadow outside the window looked like an executioner waiting to strike. But the real danger was inside. A woman had to stay awake, fighting the heavy weight of exhaustion, because closing her eyes for even a second could mean the end of her life or worse. This was the ultimate test of human survival. The stagecoach was not a vehicle of progress. It was a mobile torture chamber, a rolling trap of despair where hopes and dreams were crushed under the muddy wheels. Welcome to the uncensored history that Hollywood tried to bury. If you were there, you would not survive the first 24 hours. The overwhelming dread of the journey would snap your mind before the elements or the outlaws ever got the chance. In this brutal reality, there were no heroes riding in to save the day. There were only victims and survivors, and the line between the two was drawn in blood. Let us look deeper into the sheer terror of the physical environment itself. The dirt roads of the frontier were not roads at all, but rather jagged paths carved by wagons and the hooves of exhausted horses. The stagecoach had no suspension system, just thick leather straps that offered absolutely no relief from the brutal terrain. Passengers were thrown violently against the hard wooden walls and against each other. For a woman trying to maintain her dignity and her safety, this constant violent physical contact with strange rugged men was a psychological torment. The men would drink heavily from flasks of cheap-burning liquor to numb their own pain, turning the cramped space into a volatile powder keg. Drunken arguments would erupt in the pitch-black night right inches from her face. Knives were drawn and threats were muttered in the suffocating darkness. She had to sit perfectly still, pressing her back against the wooden frame, pretending to be asleep while her heart pounded violently against her ribs. The fear of being targeted, of drawing unwanted attention, was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The company sold tickets with the promise of safe passage, but that was a complete lie. It was a calculated trap designed to drain the pockets of desperate immigrants and hopeful families, sending them into a lawless territory where their lives held zero value. The stagecoach driver sitting high up on the bench was usually exhausted, half-drunk, and entirely indifferent to the suffering inside the cabin. His only job was to keep the horses moving forward through the nightmare. He was not a protector. He was simply the ferryman guiding a wooden boat through the river of death. The journey was a relentless assault on the senses. The fine alkaline dust of the desert seeped through every crack, coating the passengers in a thick gray film. It burned the eyes, it cracked the lips, and it settled deep within the lungs, causing violent fits of coughing that echoed the sounds of the dying. There was no escape from the filth. Women who boarded the carriage with clean clothes and hopeful hearts were quickly reduced to filthy, exhausted shells of their former selves. The pristine image of the frontier woman is a fabrication. The reality was a desperate struggle to simply keep breathing in an environment that actively tried to extinguish your life. This was the true cost of manifest destiny, a trail of broken bodies and shattered minds left behind in the dust. The carriage rolled on, ignoring the silent screams of the women trapped inside, plunging deeper into the unforgiving nightmare of the Wild West. If you were a woman on this stagecoach, you would not survive the first 24 hours purely because of your own biological needs. Let us talk about the horrifying reality that Hollywood entirely erased from history. There were no scheduled bathroom stops for women. None at all. When nature called, men would simply use a wooden bucket right inside the crowded carriage in front of everyone, or relieve themselves out the window. But for a woman trapped in the rigid social expectations of the era, this was an unimaginable psychological torture. You had to hold it for days. The agony of a bursting bladder combined with the violent shaking of the carriage caused excruciating pain. And when the carriage finally stopped at an isolated station, the nightmare only worsened. The food provided at these outposts was nothing short of a biological weapon. You were served rotting pork crawling with maggots and bread spotted with green mold. The water was drawn from shallow wells contaminated by human and animal waste. Drinking it was a death sentence. Dysentery and cholera rode for free right next to you. Within hours of eating, the bacteria would tear apart your intestines. Passengers suffered from violent diarrhea and fever, turning the cramped carriage into a suffocating chamber of infectious disease and rotting stench. Many women died simply from dehydration, as their bodies violently expelled the infected water, leaving their corpses to be unceremoniously buried in shallow, unmarked graves along the desolate trail. Why did every single woman traveling to the lawless territory carry an 8-inch steel hatpin? Do not let the movies deceive you. It was not a fashion accessory. It was a vicious instrument of death. This was the silent code of female survival in the Wild West. You were locked in a rolling dungeon with desperate men who had not seen a woman in months. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the carriage plunged into an absolute terrifying darkness. You could not see the face of the man sitting knee to knee with you, but you could smell his rotting teeth and hear his heavy breathing. You could feel a filthy hand creeping across the wooden bench. In that pitch-black void, a woman had only her instincts and her hidden arsenal. Many women sewed tiny pockets into their heavy petticoats to conceal a double-barreled Derringer pistol. But drawing a gun took time. A hatpin was already in your hand. Women were taught to grip the metal shaft and strike with brutal precision, aiming directly for the eyes or the throat of their attacker. If a man tried to force himself upon a woman in the dark, she would not scream. She would simply drive the steel spike deep into his eyeball, blinding him instantly and letting his agonizing screams serve as a bloody warning to the rest of the passengers. This was the brutal reality of frontier justice. You either became a killer in the dark, or you became another forgotten victim. The psychological warfare required to survive this rolling hell was just as exhausting as the physical torture. Imagine the sheer terror of traveling alone without a male protector in a territory where the law did not exist. To fend off the opportunistic predators sitting across from them, women developed an intricate system of mental manipulation. They would invent violent, jealous husbands waiting for them at the next station, casually mentioning how their fictional spouse had recently shot a man dead for merely looking at them. If that did not work, they would resort to the ultimate defense mechanism, which was feigning absolute madness. A woman might start muttering to herself, violently scratching her own face, or laughing hysterically into the void of the night. In an era where mental illness was deeply feared and misunderstood, acting like a lunatic was a highly effective way to disgust and terrify the men around you. You had to suppress every ounce of your sanity and embrace the madness of the prairie just to keep unwanted hands away. But playing insane for weeks on end while severely sleep-deprived began to blur the line between performance and reality. The journey from Missouri to California took 25 grueling days. 25 days with almost zero sleep. The human brain is simply not designed to withstand that level of sustained trauma and exhaustion. As the days bled into weeks, the relentless bouncing, the suffocating dust, and the lack of rest triggered a terrifying condition known as prairie madness. The sleep deprivation slowly devoured your sanity. Women reported seeing horrifying hallucinations out in the empty desert. The twisted branches of dead Joshua trees transformed into the rotting corpses of hanged men dangling in the moonlight. The howling of the prairie wind sounded exactly like the screaming of slaughtered children. You could not trust your own eyes. You could not trust the strangers breathing heavily next to you. And you certainly could not trust the driver who was likely drunk on cheap whiskey, whipping the exhausted horses toward the edge of a cliff. Your mind was completely short-circuiting. Paranoia gripped your chest like a vice. You clutched your steel hatpin so tightly that your own palms bled, waiting for an attack that might be real or might be a phantom born from your fractured mind. The descent into prairie madness was only accelerated by the constant agonizing fear of a violent death from the outside. You must understand that the stagecoach was nothing more than a slow-moving wooden box crawling across a giant open pool table. It was the perfect target. Out in the desolate plains of the lawless territory, there was absolutely nowhere to hide. Imagine sitting trapped inside that suffocating carriage when a war party of Comanche warriors suddenly appeared on the horizon. The math of survival was incredibly brutal and entirely against you. A desperate passenger with a rifle took 30 long seconds to reload a single shot. In that exact same amount of time, a skilled Comanche warrior on horseback could fire 12 deadly arrows. The warriors would ride in rapid circles around the carriage, attacking from every conceivable angle at once. As a woman trapped inside, you could not fight back effectively. All you could do was press your body against the filthy floorboards covering your head, while stone-tipped arrows violently pierced the thin wooden walls all around you. The sound of wood splintering and men screaming in agony as arrows tore through their flesh was a symphony of pure horror. The driver would furiously whip the exhausted horses, trying to outrun the attackers, but the heavy carriage was hopelessly slow. If the horses were killed or the wheels shattered, the carriage would flip, turning into a splintered death trap. When a stagecoach crashed, the human body was subjected to absolute devastation. There were no seatbelts and nothing to hold you in place. Passengers were thrown violently inside the cabin like rag dolls, smashing into the hard wooden ceiling and the metal-reinforced doors. Frontier doctors operating in filthy makeshift tents frequently reported treating women with crushed skulls, shattered collarbones, and internal organs that had been literally ruptured by the violent impact. The sheer kinetic energy of a crashing stagecoach tore human flesh apart. If you were thrown from the carriage, you risked being trampled to death by the panicked screaming horses or crushed beneath the heavy iron-rimmed wheels. The historical records are filled with horrific accounts of passengers whose bodies were mangled beyond recognition in these remote accidents. And if you survived the crash, you were left stranded in the scorching desert surrounded by the dead. And the dying with the absolute certainty that the scent of fresh blood would soon attract packs of starving wolves or predatory outlaws. This brings us to one of the most chilling and unspoken rules of frontier travel. Stagecoach drivers had an unofficial but strictly enforced policy regarding female passengers. Whenever a woman traveled alone, the driver would almost always demand that she sit right next to the carriage door. Hollywood portrays this as a gesture of frontier chivalry, an attempt to give the lady some fresh air or a better view of the landscape. Do not let the movies deceive you. The horrifying truth is far more sinister. The drivers placed women near the swinging doors so that if the stagecoach was ambushed by outlaws, or if it began to slide off the edge of a treacherous mountain cliff, the woman could be quickly thrown out or forced to jump. In a desperate situation where every ounce of weight mattered, or where a human sacrifice might distract pursuing attackers, the solitary woman was considered entirely expendable. She was positioned at the very edge of the death trap, fully aware that at any moment the door might fly open and she would be hurled into the dark abyss. You were not a respected passenger. You were cargo that could be jettisoned to save the lives of the men controlling the carriage. The physical and psychological torture of these journeys left permanent, devastating scars. Long before military psychiatrists identified the horrors of shell shock in the bloody trenches of World War I, frontier doctors were documenting the exact same symptoms in women stepping off these stagecoaches. They called it the 1,000-yard stare. Women who had witnessed their fellow passengers scalped or who had spent 3 agonizing weeks fighting off sexual predators in the dark arrived at their destinations completely broken. Their eyes were vacant and hollow. They would violently flinch at the sound of a closing door or a sudden gust of wind. The deep trauma of the journey was burned permanently into their nervous system. The historical diaries of these survivors are incredibly difficult to read. They do not write about beautiful sunsets or the spirit of adventure. They write about the unbearable stench of rotting gangrene, the sound of blood dripping onto the wooden floorboards, and the suffocating realization that humanity simply did not exist beyond the Mississippi River. They died in silence, carrying nightmares that the history books deliberately erased because the brutal truth of the frontier was simply too ugly to sell to the American public. The iconic image of the delicate frontier woman is a complete fabrication built on a foundation of lies. The women who survived the stagecoach routes of the Wild West were not fragile flowers. They were hardened survivors who had walked through the fires of hell and emerged with blood on their hands. They had to become just as ruthless, just as calculating, and just as vicious as the lawless territory itself. The next time you watch a classic Western movie and see a beautiful woman stepping gracefully out of a pristine carriage, remember the horrific reality that was hidden from you. Remember the agonizing pain of the stagecoach spine, the suffocating stench of disease, the desperate grip on an 8-inch steel hatpin in the pitch-black night, and the vacant, traumatized stare of a mind pushed beyond the absolute limits of human endurance. This was not a romantic era of exploration. It was a relentless meat grinder that consumed the innocent and rewarded only the most ruthless. Thank you for facing the dark reality of history with us on Old West History. The truth of the frontier is always written in blood, and we are here to uncover every single drop. If you survived this journey into the darkness, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling us what terrified you the most about these rolling coffins. And you must prepare yourself for our next descent into the lawless territory, where we will expose the horrifying and entirely uncensored medical nightmares waiting for those who actually made it to the ghost towns alive. You will not believe what frontier doctors used to amputate infected limbs when the whiskey ran dry.